4:15 a.m. A gravel lot outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. A horse trailer sat dark at the edge of a rodeo grounds, frost on the roof. 4 U.S. Marshals moved in from 3 sides. No sirens, no lights. The door came open in under 4 seconds. Inside, 1 sleeping bag, 1 duffel, 1 man with a scar above his right eyebrow. He woke reaching for something that wasn't there. The operator closest to him had already cleared the space. The man was prone on the trailer floor before he was fully conscious. 340 days, 5 states, 17 assumed identities. It ended in a horse trailer with frost on the roof outside a county rodeo. His name, the real one, was Rodrigo Vargas-Mena. A surveillance monitor wall at the Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force Command Center showed his file open alongside circuit contractor records, his photograph beside the name Ernesto Cruz.
The task force had been hunting him since September 2025. On the rodeo circuit, nobody had thought to look. This is the story of how a mid-tier cartel enforcer spent nearly a year in open sight, moving through 5 American states, doing physical labor at county rodeos, and was caught not by a database or a drone, but by a scar that one man remembered from a break room poster. In September 2025, a sealed federal complaint was filed in the Southern District of Texas, case number 25-CR-0847. The subject: a man identified as a mid-tier enforcement operator for a faction tied to a Sinaloa-adjacent trafficking organization operating the Laredo Interstate Corridor. The charges: conspiracy to transport controlled substances across state lines, accessory to violence and furtherance of drug trafficking, and unlawful use of a firearm in connection with a felony. The indictment did not make front pages. Mid-tier enforcers rarely do. The big names draw the cameras. The men who show up when debts go unpaid or shipments go wrong get processed in bulk. Sealed complaints, administrative detention requests, extradition requests that take years. Vargas-Mena was supposed to be different. He had been identified, located, and a surrender had been quietly arranged through intermediaries in Nuevo Laredo. The paperwork was in motion, the complaint was sealed. The plan was for him to walk across a border checkpoint with a lawyer and a deal already drafted. He never showed. The night of September 17, 2025, the safe house in Nuevo Laredo where he had been staying was empty by midnight. A cleaning crew that arrived the following morning found the beds made and the refrigerator cleaned out. Whoever had warned him had given him enough time to be thorough about it. The U.S. Marshals Service opened a fugitive file the following morning. Initial reward: $75,000. The question was not whether they would find him. The Marshals Service closes approximately 90% of its federal fugitive cases. The question was where he would go and what he would become while he was gone. What Rodrigo Vargas-Mena understood, either instinctively or by prior planning, was that visibility works better than hiding. A man living in a rented room in a major city, paying cash, avoiding cameras, reads wrong to the people around him. A man who shows up, works hard, keeps quiet, and shows up again the next day reads like background. He crossed the border on a stolen identity 6 days after disappearing from Nuevo Laredo. The identity belonged to a Mexican national with a valid visa and a clean record, a construction worker named Cesar Domingo Fuentes Rios, age 34. The documents were good enough to pass a standard checkpoint review. He carried $3,200 in cash and a bag of work clothes. He entered Texas at Laredo on September 23, 2025. For 6 weeks, he stayed in Houston. He lived in a migrant labor boarding house in the 5th Ward, paying $180 per week for a cot and locker access. He worked day labor through a cash pay landscaping operation that did not ask for documentation. He kept his head down, learned the schedules, and said almost nothing to anyone. His Spanish marked him as Northern Mexican in origin. Nobody asked about it. Half the men in that boarding house were from Sonora or Chihuahua. A quiet man with northern vowels was not a curiosity. One detail from that period later stood out to investigators reviewing his movements. He did not use a phone. Not once in 6 weeks in Houston did any device register to a location pattern consistent with his movements. No prepaid, no app-based calls. He used a payphone on Quitman Street 3 times, calls of under 2 minutes each, and the recipients of those calls were never identified. What investigators pieced together from interviews with men at the boarding house conducted months later was how he moved through daily life. He rose before 5 a.m. every morning. He was always gone before the first shift crews assembled in the common area. He returned after dark, ate alone, and was in his bunk by 9. One man who shared a wall with his cot said he never heard music, never heard a television, never heard anything except the sound of someone turning over once in the night. A man deliberately generating no friction with the world around him. What surprises me about this case isn't how he moved. To what he moved toward. Most fugitives from cartel-adjacent networks seek out that network. Safe houses, familiar faces, known infrastructure. Vargas-Mena did the opposite. He moved away from everything he knew into a world that had nothing to do with him. and became someone who was not interesting to anyone. In early November 2025, he left Houston. The trail he left was reconstructed by the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force working backward from the arrest. Investigators spread bus terminal records and cash payment receipts across a table in a command vehicle, mapping stops from Houston north through Dallas, then northwest toward Amarillo. A radar tracking display in the task force office plotted the corridor. From Amarillo, he moved briefly into New Mexico before crossing into Colorado in mid-November, where the rodeo circuit picked him up and carried him north. Somewhere in Colorado, between Pueblo and Colorado Springs, he connected with the rodeo labor circuit. Investigators reviewing the case later pulled contractor sign-in sheets from a dozen arena stops across the region. Gate workers, food vendors, animal handlers, farriers, all walk-in labor logged by first name and trade. Surveillance monitor footage from fairground security cameras shows workers moving through staging areas before and after each event. A man who shoes horses correctly, who shows up on time, moves through that system without triggering a records check. None of the stops had run his name against a federal database, none were required to. Surveillance footage from a federal holding facility shows Vargas-Mena in an interrogation room, hands flat on the table, answering questions without hesitation. When asked to demonstrate his trade, he described the sequence without prompting: the rasp, the nail set, the clinch. Body camera footage from the arresting deputy recorded the exchange. The skill was not performed. It did not need to be. His rodeo circuit paperwork identified him as Ernesto Cruz, born in Durango. U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force records show the name was never run against a federal database. Investigators later pulled the payment logs and contractor sign-in sheets from 17 stops across Nebraska and Wyoming. The handwritten name appeared on each one, unchallenged, accepted at every gate he worked through the winter and spring of 2025 and 2026. I spent time going through the circuit records that agents later pulled, and one detail kept nagging at me: the quality of his work. Every circuit operator interviewed after the arrest mentioned the same thing: he was good. Better than average. The horses were calm around him. He did not rush. That reputation spread along the circuit faster than any poster could. Drone surveillance footage and Border Patrol truck dash camera records later helped investigators trace a general corridor south toward Colorado. He worked stops in southern Colorado through November and December 2025, then moved into Wyoming in January 2026. By spring, circuit operators were calling ahead to the next stop to say he was on his way, a detail recovered from phone records reviewed by the task force. His daily life during this period was almost entirely legible in retrospect. He slept in his truck, a 2014 Ford F-250 purchased for cash in Pueblo, Colorado in November. He ate at diners and gas stations. He used a prepaid card, purchased with cash, which he reloaded with cash at convenience stores for small purchases. He never withdrew more than $400 at a time from any ATM. The Marshal Service had 3 active leads on him during this period. None of them were him. The first lead, in October 2025, placed a man matching his description at a storage facility in McAllen, Texas. Agents spent 9 days on that lead. The man turned out to be an unrelated migrant worker who matched the physical profile but had documentation that held up. The second lead, in December 2025, came from a tip to the Laredo field office suggesting he had recrossed into Mexico. That tip was pursued for 3 weeks. It was never confirmed or denied definitively, but agents eventually assessed it as deliberate misdirection, possibly planted by someone in his former network. The trail, as the lead case supervisor later described it to colleagues, went cold twice in those first 4 months. Not cold as in no leads. Cold as in the leads were wrong and the right trail was nowhere in view. Worth noting here, the system that was supposed to flag him, the federal database integration at border checkpoints, had his real name and his real biometrics. It did not have his stolen identity, because the man whose identity he had taken had not reported it stolen. Cesar Domingo Fuentes Rios discovered his documents were missing only in January 2026, when he applied for a renewal and was told a renewal had already been issued. By then, Vargas-Mena had been inside the United States for nearly 4 months. We'll say what most won't: the documentation gap that let him through is not the fault of the checkpoint officer who waved him in. It is a structural failure of a system that treats identity theft as a downstream problem rather than an upstream one. The checkpoint did its job. The system around it did not.
It was there from the 2025 period that the lead investigator later flagged in internal case notes and seemed in hindsight. A deputy assigned to the Laredo field office had pulled employment records from 3-day labor operations in the Houston 5th Ward corridor as part of a routine sweep. One of those records listed a Cesar Fuentes, age approximately 34, northern Mexican accent, departed employment in early November. The deputy ran the name, found 17 variations, and moved on. The record was not cross-referenced against the Vargas-Mena file because the case was at that point still being worked primarily through cartel network contacts and border intelligence. The labor circuit was not a category anyone was searching. The record sat in a database untouched until agents pulled it retroactively in April 2026 after the print match.
The third lead is where this story changes. In February 2026, body camera footage from the North Platte Fairgrounds shows Dale Whitaker moving through a livestock staging area, guiding a trailer into position. Whitaker was a livestock transport contractor who had worked the circuit for 11 years. He was not an informant. He had no relationship with law enforcement. He was, as far as anyone knew, a man who drove horses from one county to another. Dash camera footage from a Marshals Service liaison vehicle shows the officer entering the North Platte Fairgrounds for a county sheriff briefing 2 months before the arrest. A body camera clip from the same visit shows the officer pinning a fugitive awareness poster to a bulletin board in the break room, alongside notices for lost dogs and local events. By the time Vargas-Mena worked that stop, the edges of the poster were curling. Whitaker looked at it the way most people look at things on break room bulletin boards. Not carefully, just long enough for something to register without fully registering. The man in the photo had a scar above his right eyebrow. 6 weeks later, in late March 2026, a body camera worn by a fairground security officer in Ogallala, Nebraska, captured a man in a work jacket moving near the tack room after the final night of competition. He lifted a saddlebag into a storage space. The fluorescent light caught the right side of his face. Whitaker, visible in the same footage loading horses nearby, later told investigators it was the same farrier from North Platte. The scar above the eyebrow. Whitaker did not do anything that day. He did not approach the man. He did not call anyone. He drove home that night and thought about what he had seen, and whether what he had seen was what he thought he had seen. 4 days later, he called the tip line listed on the poster. Think about that for a second. You're not a law enforcement person. You saw a face on a bulletin board weeks ago. You think you saw that face again at a work site. You have no certainty. You're about to call a federal tip line and describe something that might be nothing. The number of people who would actually make that call is smaller than we tend to assume. He made it anyway. The tip reached the Marshals Service Fugitive Operations Center on March 31, 2026. The initial report, an unnamed male, working as a farrier on the Rodeo Circuit, Nebraska location, matches poster description, has visible scar consistent with wanted subject. The lead investigator assigned to the Vargas-Mena case, a deputy marshal with the Great Plains Regional Fugitive Task Force, reviewed the tip that same afternoon. It was assessed as low confidence but high novelty. Nothing in the prior investigation had placed the subject on a labor circuit. It was a new angle. Investigators pulled circuit records for the Nebraska and Wyoming rodeo calendar and spread them across a table in a U.S. Marshals command vehicle. 12 stops had payment records pulled for review, cash receipts, never more than $400 per event. A radar tracking display at the task force office mapped each stop against a timeline. 17 locations, 17 logged appearances under the same name. The pattern was consistent with someone deliberately staying below the cash reporting threshold. The investigator ran the alias Ernesto Cruz through available databases and found 17 individuals with variations of that name in the relevant demographic range. None of them matched the wanted subject's biometrics in any way that could be confirmed without a fingerprint comparison. Fingerprints. To get a usable fingerprint from a person who has not been arrested, you need either a court-authorized covert collection or a discarded object from a public space. Covert collection takes time and proximity. Discarded objects depend on luck and observation. The investigator identified the next scheduled rodeo stop where a farrier matching the description had been confirmed as working the Casper County Fair in Wyoming, scheduled for mid-April 2026. He coordinated with the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation and deployed 2 surveillance personnel to the event. Their instructions were simple. Observe. Do not approach. Wait for the subject to discard something with a surface that could carry a latent print. The 2 surveillance personnel who worked the Casper County Fair were not in uniform and were not identified as law enforcement to event staff. One posed as a vendor assistant working a food concession near the animal holding area. The other moved through the grounds as an equipment observer, carrying a clipboard and wearing a contractor badge prepared by the Wyoming DCI. Over 2 days, they documented the subject's movements in 40-minute observation windows, logging each location, each interaction, each object he touched, and whether he kept it or set it down. The logs ran to 11 pages. Most of what was in them was nothing. A man working, a man eating. A man watching horses with the patience of someone who had spent years around animals and had nowhere particular to be. The farrier who showed up at the Casper County Fair on April 14, 2026 was Ernesto Cruz. He worked 2 days. On the second day, during a break, he bought a large coffee from a vendor near the animal holding area. He drank it over 40 minutes while sitting on a fence rail watching horses being prepped for an evening event. When he was done, he set the cup on top of a fence post and walked back to the tacking area. One of the surveillance personnel retrieved the cup. The latent print lifted from that cup was matched against the federal database within 18 hours. The match probability came back at 99.97%. Rodrigo Esteban Vargas-Mena, 340 days. Case 25 CR 0847, located. The raid was over before anyone else at the rodeo grounds had woken up. But what the arrest set in motion was only beginning. The tactical decision made by the Marshals Service Task Force was deliberate. They did not move immediately after the print match. They continued surveillance for 11 weeks, tracking his movement across the circuit from Casper to Laramie to Rollins and back north toward Cheyenne. They wanted to confirm patterns, rule out any protective network, and make sure that when they moved, they would find him alone. During those 11 weeks, the surveillance team rotated personnel every 8 to 10 days to prevent the subject from becoming familiar with any face in his peripheral environment. 9 different personnel rotated through the operation. Each handoff required a full briefing on the subject's established patterns when he woke, which diners he preferred, how far he parked from the arena entrance, whether he varied his routes between stops. He did not vary his routes. He drove the same roads, stopped at the same chain gas stations, and bought coffee at roughly the same time each morning. Routine was either a comfort to him or something he had not thought to break. There was one complication in that period. In late May 2026, the subject appeared to change his routine. He stopped sleeping in his truck at some stops and began sleeping in the horse trailer he was using to transport equipment. The surveillance team assessed this as a response to a minor altercation with another worker at a Laramie stop, not as evidence that he had detected surveillance, but it required a tactical revision. Entry through a truck door and entry through a trailer door are different problems. The Wyoming DCI brought in a SWAT-qualified entry team for the final operation. The Marshals Task Force kept operational control. The entry plan was rehearsed twice on a comparable trailer at a DCI facility in Cheyenne. One detail that stuck with the lead investigator on the night of the operation: the temperature outside the trailer was 41 degrees. The subject had no heating unit inside. He had been sleeping in a 41-degree metal trailer because it was what he had. Whatever the enforcer hierarchy he had belonged to looked like at its top, at its edges, it looked like a sleeping bag in a cold trailer at a Wyoming rodeo ground. On July 20th, 2026, at 04:15 a.m., the task force moved 4 operators. 2 at the trailer door, 1 at the truck cab to prevent any attempt to access the vehicle. 1 covering the trailer's rear vent, which was large enough for egress if someone moved quickly. The door was breached with a hydraulic spreader. 4 seconds. The man inside reached toward the wall of the trailer before being controlled. There was no weapon on the wall. There was a jacket. He may have been reaching for warmth, not for a weapon. The operators did not wait to find out. No shots fired. No injuries. Rodrigo Esteban Vargas-Mena was in federal custody at 04:17 a.m. He was transported to a federal detention facility in Cheyenne and processed. Within 6 hours, his true identity was confirmed through biometric comparison. The sealed complaint in the Southern District of Texas was unsealed, and the $75,000 reward was formally designated for payment to the tipster, subject to completion of the standard process. Dale Whitaker had not expected to receive any money. Not called the tip line thinking about the reward. He told investigators later that he called because the face bothered him. He could not stop thinking about the scar. Here's the question I keep coming back to. Is it luck or design that a 340-day federal manhunt came down to one man remembering a detail from a bulletin board poster? And how many other faces are on those boards right now that nobody has taken the time to remember? The unsealing of the complaint triggered a parallel review process in the Southern District of Texas. Federal prosecutors reviewed the charges and confirmed their intention to proceed on all counts. The conspiracy charge carries a mandatory minimum of 10 years. The accessory to violence charge carries an additional 5 to 15 years depending on the specific acts proven at trial. The firearms charge adds another 5 years, mandatory and consecutive. His defense attorney, assigned at arraignment, has not yet filed motions as of this recording. In the hours following the arraignment, federal investigators conducted a preliminary interview with Vargas-Mena at the Cheyenne detention facility. He was advised of his rights in both English and Spanish. He acknowledged understanding. He then said nothing further for the remainder of the session. His attorney, reached by phone during the interview process, instructed him to remain silent, and he complied. Investigators noted that he was calm throughout. He sat with his hands flat on the table. He did not ask about the charges, did not ask about the reward, did not ask about who had identified him. He looked, one investigator later wrote in case notes, like a man who had already run the calculation and knew what the numbers came out to. The informant network inside the trafficking organization that the original complaint referenced. The investigation into that network is ongoing. The Vargas-Mena arrest did not close that case, it added to it. What prosecutors now have is a witness who, if he chooses to cooperate, has direct knowledge of the Laredo corridor operations from the enforcement side, not the logistics side. That is a different kind of information than what was available before. Whether he cooperates is not yet known. There is one thread from this case that remains unresolved, and it matters. The identity documents he used, the stolen Cesar Domingo Fuentes Rios visa, were high enough quality to pass checkpoint review for 4 months. That quality does not come from a street-level forger. The investigation into the source of those documents is active but has not produced a confirmed suspect. Someone, somewhere in a document production chain, made materials good enough to get a fugitive from a sealed federal complaint across the U.S. border and into the interior for nearly a year. That person has not been identified. If you've followed cases like this before, you know the document chain is almost always the harder arrest than the fugitive himself. The fugitive has a face, a scar, a pattern. The document maker has a reputation and a referral network and may be in a country where U.S. warrants are difficult to execute. There's a piece of this case we couldn't verify on camera because the document chain investigation is still open. If you want part 2 when it breaks, subscribe so you don't miss it when the charges come. Looking back, what this case tells us about the fugitive infrastructure supporting cartel-adjacent networks is something investigators have known for years and have not been able to fully address. The labor economy of the American interior is a functional disappearance mechanism. Not because anyone in it is complicit, but because it was not designed with surveillance in mind. Cash wages, informal paperwork, transient workers, frequent location changes. These are features of seasonal labor, not cartel tradcraft, but they function identically from a surveillance standpoint. The Marshals Service has closed this file. The file it opened on the document chain is still running. The Rodeo circuit continues. Somewhere on it right now, there are workers whose paperwork would not survive a federal database query. Most of them are exactly what they appear to be, people working hard for cash wages. A small number may not be. Rodrigo Esteban Vargas-Mena will stand trial in the Southern District of Texas. The exact date has not been set. The charges are not in dispute. What will be contested by his attorney is the evidentiary foundation for each count, the admissibility of information obtained through the investigation, and what role, if any, cooperation with the government might play in any eventual resolution. 340 days is a long time to be invisible. The scar made it shorter. Were you watching this story wondering when someone would finally spot him? Comment yes or no. Would you have recognized that face from a bulletin board poster 6 weeks after seeing it? The network he was part of continues to operate along the Laredo corridor. The specific faction named in the complaint has not been dismantled. The corridor itself, the interstate route he was charged with supporting, processed an estimated $2.4 billion in product across its lifetime, according to federal prosecutor estimates included in the original complaint. The arrest of one mid-tier enforcer removes one person from that structure. It does not change the economics that make the structure function. The demand that creates the corridor still exists. The horse trailer where he was arrested has been returned to its owner, a rodeo equipment rental company in Laramie. The sleeping bag and the duffel were held as evidence. The frost on the roof, that morning outside Cheyenne, melted before the sun was fully up.